So what will View 3 bring? And important, View 3 is not out yet at the point of time I'm recording this video, but what will it bring once it is out? Now, first of all, it's important to understand that View 3, the framework itself, the code base behind the framework, will be completely rewritten. And that's important though. I'm talking about under the hood change. Under the hood, it's rewritten. The code base is rewritten. It works differently under the hood. It brings us many advantages, to which I'll come back. But the syntax you use, the way you work with Vue, does not change. It stays the same. That is really important. It's not a complete rewrite as Angular 2 was for Angular 1. It's a under the hood rewrite that keeps the syntax and the usage patterns you're used to. Now, why does this rewrite happen and why do we have a new version? Well, for one, this framework is rewritten to take advantage of some new JavaScript features and some new ideas the team gathered over the years to offer us better performance. So due to internal changes and next-gen JavaScript features being used, for example, the proxy API, Vue 3 works a bit differently under the hood and tends to have way better performance. Potentially, we can get huge performance gains. And this is basically a free win because, as I mentioned, you don't need to change your code for this to happen. If you use Vue 3, you can basically write Vue applications as you did in the past, and you will get this better performance out of the box. Now, better performance is not the only advantage of Vue 3 though. We also get better TypeScript support, and important, TypeScript stays optional. Now, you could already use TypeScript with Vue 2 apps, but their support was limited. Some things were not really working. You didn't get type support everywhere. IDE support was not that great. And since Vue 3 internally uses TypeScript in its code base now, it has way better TypeScript support. So it's still optional. You can build Vue apps with vanilla JavaScript, both with Vue 2 and Vue 3. But with Vue 3, it will be much easier to use TypeScript if you want to. And then there is one huge new feature which actually does mean that the syntax changes, but this feature is optional. There is a new way of building components, you could say, or of configuring components. You can use the so-called composition API. Now, it's totally optional. It's an alternative to the traditional way of building components. And in this video, I will show you both the traditional way and how it would look like when using the composition API. And this API, therefore, can replace the old syntax, but doesn't have to. If you don't want to use it, you don't have to use it. So it's not removing the old syntax, it's not changing the old syntax, it's purely additive, which means it's just an addition. So you can use this new syntax for building your components, and this syntax will offer some advantages, which I'll also show you in this video. So with that, you have the overview. Let's now dive in and let's focus on this new composition API because that is the biggest change which potentially can affect everyone. Now keep in mind, it's optional though. Now the cool thing is we can already play around with this new API, at least with the majority of its features, in Vue 2 applications. So below the video you'll find a link to this starting project, and this starting project actually uses Vue version 2, not Vue version 3, because as I mentioned, at the point of time I'm recording this, and for quite some time still, Vue 3 is not stable yet, it's in beta. A release can be expected in early to mid 2020, I would say. For now, Vue 2 is the latest version. And still we can use this new API. But to use it, let's first of all understand the old API and understand its limitations. So you got a very simple application here, and if you run npm install and then npm run serve, so effectively executing this serve script here, you get a running development server, which you should keep up and running. And this will host this simple application here, which you can open in a new tab under localhost 8080, where for one, you have this button to toggle this dummy content here, and where you also have these two inputs where you can enter some data to add new items here to a list down there, like this. And then you can click on these items to also delete them. Now, it's of course not a super fancy app, but it will be a great example for the limitations and also for how to use the new composition API. if we have a quick look at the project, we see that I have 3 Vue components here. I have the app component. The app component renders this div with that button and the toggleable paragraph here. And then I render a product form and a products component, which are, of course, these 2 other components I have here, which I import here, which I register as local components in the app component. And then in the app component, I got some data, I got an array of products, and I got the show user info boolean. I got the create product method here in the end, which adds a new product to this products array. I got the delete product method, which deletes a product. And I got the toggle user info method. Now, toggle user info simply changes this show user info data property here. And toggle user info gets fired when we click this button. Create product gets fired from inside the product form. I pass a pointer to the create product method here, to the create product prop in product form. And here in products, I also have remove as a prop to which I pass a pointer at delete product. And this is one way of ensuring that these methods, which are defined here in the app component, can be called from inside these 2 child components. Now let's have a look at these components. The products component is relatively straightforward. It receives props, it receives the items prop, which is an array and required, and the remove prop, which is a function. Remember, I'm passing in a pointer at delete product to remove. So which is a function, which is also required. And then here I have remove product as a method in the products component as well. But all I do in there is call this remove prop function we're getting here. And this remove product method here in the end gets triggered when we click on, well, a rendered list item, a rendered product. And in the template, I just output my list of products here with v4. I go through all my items. Items is one prop I got here, and this in turn holds the products array we manage in the app component. And then we also got the title and the price being output here. We got some styling at the bottom, and that's it. And in product form, I have a form in my template with 2 inputs, one for the title, one for the price. Got the submit button, which is disabled if the inputs are not valid. And then here we also have the create product function, which is received as a prop. We got some data for the title input, for the price input, and for whether the form has been submitted or not. Then here I got some computed properties, one for the price, which simply converts the price input, which is text, to a number, and is valid, which checks the title and the price input and determines whether they're not empty and hold valid inputs, in which case is valid is set to true. Is valid is used here to control the disabled button. Then I got a watcher here where I basically watch the submitted data field here. And whenever that changes, we run the watcher. There I check if it is true, in which case I set it to false and I reset the inputs so that basically the form is reset whenever we submit it. Because submitted will be set to false inside of the save product method, which is bound to the form submission here with add submit. And there in the end, all I do is I prevent the default and I call create product, which if you remember is received through props here. So I call that function which I receive through props, and to that function I pass the entered inputs, and thereafter we submit the form, which triggers this form resetting logic. Now, if the inputs are empty here, you will see I can press the save button, but actually it is disabled. I just don't have a special style for that. If we inspect it though, we see it's disabled. So indeed, this is disabled here, and only if we have valid inputs here, you see it gets enabled, and we can add this. So this is how this all works, and that's a fairly trivial default Vue app, which you also could build in different ways, but which also should work relatively fine. Now, which limitations does this have? Because this is the Vue syntax we all know and love, and it's fairly straightforward, so what's wrong with it? Now, there isn't necessarily something wrong with it. There just can be problems in bigger Vue applications. If you have a Vue application with dozens or hundreds of components, that components, especially bigger components, can be hard to reason about and hard to manage. Here we have small components, right? These are all very small components with some data, with some computed methods, with some methods which are triggered upon events, and that's it. But the bigger and the more complex your application gets, the more complex your components can get, and the longer they can get. And then this traditional way of building components and of configuring them, also often called the Component Options API, which I'm using here, can reach its limits or can lead to components that are harder to manage, also when it comes to code reusage. Now, for example, take the app view file. There I have, in the end, two different kinds of data I'm managing: the products and show user info. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a super small component, and this is definitely not a component that's hard to understand. But if it were bigger, then having different data pieces which are managed independently in a component can be harder to understand. Why? Because with the Options API, we organize our different component features not by feature, but by option. So we, first of all, specify which data this component is concerned about: products and show user info. And then we might have computed and watch and methods, like in this case. And here again, I have methods related to my products, and then also a method related to the user info. So in the end, we have two features going on in this app component, you could say: products and this user info. In this case, user info, the only data related to that is whether we show it or not. But this could be more complex as well. It could be more complex user info. It could be the logic to fetch it from a server. So this easily could be more complex. I'm just keeping it simple here so that we have a chance of going through this code in a simple tutorial and video. So it would be nice, or it could be nice in bigger apps, if we could split this. If the data sits next to the logic, next to the functions and methods that work with it, and we therefore organize our component configuration by feature and not by option. So that we don't say, here's the data, here are the methods, but that we say, okay, here's everything related to products, and then below that, here's everything related to show user info. That's one thing where you will see in a second that the new composition API can help us. It's not the only thing. Think about reusability. Now, in this app, we don't have much which we could want to reuse. We have a fairly trivial application here. But in the product form here, maybe we have some logic which we would love to reuse in other parts of our application as well. Maybe form-related logic, which we then write in a more generic way, but which we then can use in any form and not just in this form. Maybe also something as trivial as this toggling logic here in the app component. Here we're toggling user info, but in other parts of the app we might be toggling details about a blog post or details about a product we're listing. So code reusage also is something which can be difficult. Now, before we dive into the composition API to see how it solves these problems, let me show you how we could make our code more reusable in traditional Vue, so in Vue 2 syntax only. We could work with a mix-in. Let's say we want to make sure that we manage this toggling logic, so this data piece here, show user info, and this method here to change it, in a separate mix-in. For that, we could simply create a new folder, maybe named Mixins, and there we have the toggle.js file, and in there we export a constant toggle mixin, which holds an object, which holds a data function, where I return data, where I have just a show prop, let's say, and which also has a methods object, where we have the toggle method, let's say, and in there, I simply set this show equal to what this show is currently not. So that's in the end just a more generic form of the toggling logic we have in the app component. This could allow us to get rid of toggle user info and show user info, and we could instead import our mixin object. So we import from the mixins folder the toggle mixin, and there I named it toggle mixin, so let's import toggle mixin here. And now in the app component, we can add this new Mixins option here, which is an array of mixins we want to mix into this component, and there I refer to the toggle mixin. This is how mixins work in Vue. Now what happens is that the data of this component will be merged with the data defined here in the mixin, and the methods of this component also will be merged with the methods of this mixin. And hence, with that, if we go back here to the app view component, and we now adjust our template to refer just to a toggle method here, because I named it toggle in the mixin, and then just to show here and also here, and we save all of that, this rebuilds just fine, and our toggle logic still works. So we can reuse this toggling logic now. Problem solved, right? Now, not entirely. For this simple app, it certainly does the trick, but one downside with mixins is that inside of the app component, we can't easily see what the mixin adds. Sure, we can dive into the code of the mixin, but then we have to remember what's in there when we come back to the component. For example, that the method is now called toggle and the data property is called show. We have to remember that. It's defined in the mixin, and of course, this is not too much to remember, but if you work with tons of mixins, this gets harder. Also, if you have multiple mixins you use in one and the same component, mixins might start to overwrite each other. So one mixin might interfere with functionality added by another mixin because you're using the same names in different mixins. This can be a potential issue. Of course, one you can avoid by ensuring that you don't reuse names across mixins, but it is something which you can forget or overlook, and then you introduce a nasty bug. So mixins are helpful, but not the perfect solution. So here now we have another example of what's not ideal. And now that we know all these things which are not ideal, let's finally come to the composition API and see how that works and how it helps us solve these problems. So time for the composition API. First of all, we have to install a package in order to be able to use it in a Vue 2 application. So quit the development server and run npm install -- save @vue/composition-API. This installs this extra package for Vue 2, important for Vue 2, which allows you to use this syntax which will be included in Vue 3 by default in Vue 2 apps already. And thereafter, you can restart that development server. So now we can use this new API in older projects. And this is mostly meant to experiment with it. You could, of course, use it in production apps too, but there are things which still might change. There might still be bugs in there. So primarily, it's really meant to experiment with it. So now with it installed, let's convert the app component here actually to an app component, which does not use this options API, but instead uses this new composition API. And for that, I'll first of all get rid of mixins here and bring back my old way of managing show user info just inside of here, simply so that we can first translate this all to the new API before I then again show you how to implement code reusage. So here I renamed this to toggle user info again, and here it's show user info. And now let's translate this entire component configuration here to use the new API. And we can also get rid of this import here, by the way. Now the new composition API adds a new item we can add to our component object. We leave components here, that does not change, but now we can add a setup method here. It has to be named setup, and it is available because of that new API we're using, because of the composition API. So we can add setup to our component objects now. Now setup is a method, and in here we now manage our state, so to say, our data of this component, and we also manage all the functions which should manipulate this. Now, for example here, I got two pieces of data. I got products and show user info. We could add a new constant here, products, and initialize this to an empty array. So I basically converted this property in the data object to a regular constant in JavaScript. And the same for show user info, which I'll set to false here. Next, we can add a function which allows us to, for example, create a new product. So I'll add a const here, and of course we could also use the function keyword to create a function. But I'll use const, create product, and create an arrow function here. But a normal function would work as well. An arrow function which receives the title and the price, and which then basically does what I did in the create product function down there. I create a new product object, and now I don't add it to this product, but just to products. Important, the this keyword is not available in this setup function because it will run before the component object is fully initialized in the end. So this is not available in here, or it is available, but it will not refer to the view component. But we don't need it here either because we just want to interact with this regular constant here, with this regular JavaScript constant. Now besides create product, I'll add a new function here in this setup method. And that, of course, is my delete product function. So I'll just copy this here, add it here, add an exclamation mark here, and an arrow here. And it's not this product, but it's just products and products. And now, since I plan on changing products, I will actually change this from a const to a let, because I assign a new value to products here when I override it with a filtered version of this array. And last but not least, toggle user info. This can also be added as a function here. So here I have toggle user info, add an exclamation mark and an arrow. And now it's not this show user info, but just show user info. And since I changed my value of show user info here, I will also change this from a const to a let. Now we have that here, and now we can remove data and methods because I basically have all which I had in there in the setup method now. Now, what's the gain of this and how does this work? Well, it doesn't work yet. We're getting started, we're making our first steps in the right direction, but we're not done yet. To make this work, we now have to return something here in the setup function, an object which Vue will take into account when it renders this component template, when it parses this component template for the first time. In this object which we return here, we now return everything we want to expose to our template. So for example here, my products, my show user info, boolean, create product, delete product, and toggle user info. Now in case you're wondering about this shortcut, this is just a shorthand for writing basically this all the time. If the name of the property is equal to the variable you assign as a value, you can omit the colon and the value assignment. JavaScript will expand it automatically. So I'm exposing all this data now to the template. This is what this return statement does. Under the hood, Vue will pick it up and now render the template with all this data available. So in the template, we can now use toggle user info because I'm exposing it here. We can use show user info because I'm exposing a key of that name here. And the value will be the value stored in the show user info variable. And now if we save this, you will see we get a bunch of errors here. Now the reason for this is that Vue is not yet aware of the fact that we want to use the Vue composition API. In order to make Vue aware, we should go to the main.js file and in there add a new import Vue composition API or any name of your choice from @Vue composition API, so the package we installed a few seconds ago. And then simply run Vue use and pass in the Vue composition API like this to add this as a plugin into your Vue app basically. With this now rebuilds and works. But you will see that if you click this button, for example, nothing updates here. The form will work because there we mostly use the components with the old style, but this toggle button does definitely not do the trick. The reason for that is that we're technically using this composition API with this setup method, and we provide everything to Vue it needs to render this component or to render the template with the data we return from the setup method. But once the setup method is done running, Vue basically has no inclination to render the template a second time after the initial render. Now in traditional Vue, so without that composition API, it, for example, keeps track of the data you have, and whenever that data changes, it re-renders the UI, and the same for computed properties and so on. Now here the problem we have is that Vue does not keep track of products and show user info. So when this changes, because, for example, toggle user info is executed, which it is, well, then it will not re-render because Vue does not keep track of show user info. It does not see that this has a new value and that it should re-render the template. To tell Vue to do this, you have two ways now with the new API. We need to import something from that new API. So from @Vue composition API. The first way of defining data on which Vue should keep an eye is by importing Reactive from there. With Reactive, you can basically tell Vue about an object which properties should be watched. You use it by calling Reactive as a function, and to that you pass an object where you, for example, have a show property which initially is false. And now with this setup, here we would set showUserInfo.show equal to what showUserInfo.show is currently not. And now, since we used Reactive up here, Vue will keep an eye on that object and on its properties, and if one of those properties changes, it will re-render. So now we just have to adjust our code here and refer to showUserInfo.show, showUserInfo.show, and if we now save this after these adjustments, this works again and toggling works. So Reactive is one way of telling Vue about an object it should watch out for. But what if you don't want to use an object? Here we only need a boolean after all. Well, for that you can use a ref. You can import ref from the Vue composition API, and instead of using this approach, we can now add a constant, showUserInfo, and initialize it with ref, which takes a default value of false. Now this in the end creates a tiny wrapper around this value and stores this in showUserInfo. And now we can use showUserInfo.value. The value property is added by Vue. So whatever you initialize with a ref is basically always an object which has a value property. And that value property holds the value you use here as an initial value. And then I set this to a new value down there. In your template, you don't have to access .value. Vue will do this automatically for you if it detects that you're working with a ref. So here we can then just use showUserInfo like this, and Vue will automatically have a look at the value property. And now with ref, this is also a property or a value Vue will keep an eye on, and whenever you assign a new value, Vue will update the template. And now I just have to get rid of the reactive import to satisfy my linter here and get rid of the error. So now with this, toggling again works. And this is now a very lean way of managing this showUserInfo data as a reactive state. Now this is now a const instead of a let because I never assign a new value to showUserInfo. I only assign a new value to the value property, which as I mentioned, Vue adds automatically. And with that, we can do the same for products, of course. We can change products to be a const and use ref to initialize it to an empty array. And then in create product, I access products.value and push a new product. And down here, I set products.value equal to products.value.filter. And now with that, if we save this, you see this works. And if I add a book here for $12.99, this also works, adding and deleting. So this is now the composition API in a nutshell, but where's the advantage? It's a different way, but how does it help us with the problems I mentioned earlier? Well, let's first of all consider that we want to have a big component, but we want to keep the data we use in a component in one feature of the component close to the logic that changes that data. That was one problem we had before. Well, it's easier now. We can take the showUserInfo const, remove it here, and maybe add it here close to the toggleUserInfo function. With that, I got my products data, and all the functions that change products sit directly next to each other. And I got my showUserInfo data sit directly next to the function that changes it. So now we have features sit close to each other. Reusability is also easier. We can create so-called composition functions. I'll store them in a folder named comp functions here. For example, a toggle.js file, where I simply export a function which by convention should start with use. If you worked with React and React hooks, this might look familiar to you, and the entire API might actually look a bit familiar to you. So here I then use as a starting prefix on my name here, and then maybe use toggle. And this is now simply a function in which we can use features from the composition API. We can import ref from @viewCompositionAPI here, for example, and manage our toggle state here with ref false, and have our function here, our show state, and have our function here toggle, which will change this state, where I basically set show value equal to what show value is not. And then here in this use toggle function, I return an object which exposes show and toggle. So the show constant and the toggle function here. And now we can import this, since it's a normal JavaScript function, into our app component. Here we can now import use toggle from comp functions toggle and simply add this here into our setup function. So here, instead of managing our toggling logic like this, we can simply execute use toggle, which I'm importing from that toggle.js file in the comp functions folder. And use toggle returns an object, right? It returns an object with the show constant and the value in there, which is a ref, which is reactive and watched by view, and the toggle function. So we can use object destructuring here to pull out these values and have our show data piece, which we can even rename to show user info with this destructuring syntax, and have our toggle function here, which we can rename to toggle user info. And now with that, I'm destructuring what I get back from use toggle, and use toggling has my reactive logic. I have less logic in app component, and I could use toggle in any other component. But unlike in Mixins, I see what's in there. I will get IntelliSense support. I get support in general by my IDE here. And Vue and the compiler can actually also look into this function and warn me at an earlier point of time when I try to use something which is not part of that function. And also, because it's a regular JavaScript function, I can add multiple such functions from different files into one and the same component. And since the logic resides inside of a function and gets not merged with the existing component, we also avoid name clashes and so on. So all the problems we had with Mixins, they're now gone. And therefore, since I also renamed this here with this destructuring syntax, I have my working component with the logic outsourced into this custom composition function, which uses features from the composition API. So that solves our mix-in problem, and it's now a way more elegant way of sharing and reusing logic. So this hopefully shows you why this new composition API is interesting. It can solve problems you encounter in bigger applications and bigger components. That's the main part of the video. As a little bonus, let's now also translate the product form component to use the new composition API, because that might also be interesting since we there also have computed values and watched values. So let's practice working with the composition API here in the product form component. It's of course a component built with the traditional options API, and therefore let's now see how this would translate to the new API. First of all, here in the script tags, let's import something from the new API, from @viewCompositionAPI, because we'll definitely need something from it here in this component. We'll definitely need a ref, the ref function, because we have some data which we want to manage here. Maybe we also want to have the reactive function to also manage grouped data in an object. So let's get started. We still define props like this. This does not change. So we still define what we get in this component like this. The composition API doesn't replace everything you had in your old API. It mainly replaces data, methods, computed, and watch. So we can now get rid of data here and instead add the setup method again. Now in the setup method here, I have my three data pieces here. I have my, let's say, input state, which I'll initialize with reactive, to which I pass an object which has the title, which initially is an empty string, and the price, which initially is an empty string. And then I have this standalone submitted value, which I'll initialize with a ref, like this. So basically now the data we used is translated to the new syntax in the composition API. Now with that, let's also work on the methods before we have a look at computed and watch. There I have to save product method, so I'll copy this and comment out the methods object here and add this here now in setup. So here I now have save product, which is an arrow function which gets an event, which I prevent here. And now here, this won't work. I mentioned this before. We can't use this here because from inside the setup method, you can't access methods in the old API and so on. This does not work. Instead here, I now of course want to work with create product, which is a prop. Now, since I can't use this to reach out to the component instance, I need a different way of working with that prop. And thankfully, setup receives an argument, a parameter, if you want. It receives the props parameter, which gives us access to all the props this component receives. So when Vue executes setup for us, it will give us access to all the props this component receives, so that inside of setup and of all the functions we define in setup, we can work with those props. So then here we can simply call props.createProduct. CreateProduct is a prop here, and with that I'm calling it. Well, title input, that's in the end now input state dot title, right? And here I got input state dot price, at least almost. This will not be the final data we forward, but good enough for now. Now for submitted, I will now set submitted dot value equal to true here. So now the method was carried over. But what about computed and watched values? Let's start with watch. Here I'm watching submitted, and when it changes, I in the end clear my input. Well, let's comment this out and rewrite it in the composition API. There we can import a watch function. So we can execute this here now. Maybe here. It's up to you where exactly you do this. You can execute watch, and watch now takes a function. By the way, all these functions I'm showing you, watch and reactive and so on, can be used and configured in different ways, and the official API documentation, which you of course also find linked below the video, is a great place to learn all about the different variations. Here I show the basic forms. So in the basic form, watch takes a function, and Vue will automatically kind of look into the function and see with which data you work in there, and it will automatically watch the data with which you work so that it knows when to rerun this function you passed to watch. So here I'll check submitted.value and check if this is true, and if it is, I will set input state.title to an empty string and input state.price to an empty string to reset it, and then here submitted.value back to false. Now, by the way, in the product form template, I'm using two-way binding on title input and price input. This will still work with these reactive values. Of course, I have to adjust the names later though, but we'll come back to this. So for now, I'm watching my values here. What about computed? There, I basically want to convert the entered price to a price, which is always a number or float specifically, and I have this is valid computed value. Well, we also can import a computed function from the composition API, from the Vue package. Maybe we execute this here, and computed works a bit differently than watch. Computed will return a value, for example, the price, or the price as number, maybe, to make it clear what it will be. And then computed also takes a function. The difference to watch just is that computed returns a value. Now, what goes into this function? Well, our computed value logic. So basically here, for price, this returned value. Like this. And now this returned value will in the end be stored here. And just as with watch, Vue will automatically have a look at what you're using in there and watch this value and rerun this function here whenever this value changes. Now, the only important thing here, of course, is this price input is wrong. This, of course, should be input state.price. Now we have another computed value, and that is valid. So let's copy all of this, and thereafter we can also comment out computed down there and get rid of it. And then here I will add is valid and use computed and pass a function to computed. And in here, I have my logic. Now again, it's not this title input.trim, it's instead input state.title.trim. And here I check if price as number, which is the value with which I want to work here, if that is not a number or if that is smaller or equal than 0, and then I'm good. And now there's one important step. You must never forget this. Whatever you're doing here in your setup function, in your setup method is nice, but in order to be able to use it in the template, you need to return it. So at the end of setup, you need to return what should be available in the template. In my case here, that's the input state. It's also the save product function and the isValidComputed property, or computed value, I should say. Now, the submitted value is not required and price as number is also not required in the template, hence we don't need to return it. Now some adjustments are required on the template. There, save product has the same name, but for title input, it's now input state.title to which I want to bind, and here it's input state.price to which I want to bind. The rest is the same, and if we now save this, it therefore should work. Now if we go back and we try to use this, we see this doesn't work. Now the reason for this is that in our code in computed for isValid, I'm referring to price's number, and price's number is the result of computed. Now it turns out what you get back in such a case is basically a ref, so similar to what we got when we used the ref function here in the app component. And remember that what we get back here is an object which always has a value property. So in the end, the computed value is hidden under a value property in an object, which is returned by computed. So here we should check for price's number.value and price's number.value like this. And if we do this and we save this now, we can add a book for $12.99, and at least this works, but now we get a different error. The price to fixed is not a function. Well, that simply stems from the fact that in my save product function here in the product form, I'm forwarding input state.price to my component which gave me that create product prop, so to the app component. And that now is a string, however, because input state.price is a string. That never changed. I, of course, want to forward my price as number. So down there, it's price as number.value, which I want to forward next to input state.title. And with this now, after reloading this one more time, if we now create a book here, you see this works. And if I add a carpet for $129.99, this also works, and I can delete this as well. And now everything has been translated to the composition API. Now, I know that this is a lot of new stuff, and on first sight, it looks like a lot of overhead to learn, a lot of new things to learn without a great reason to do so, right? Now, if you never had Vue apps where you found that the existing API caused problems, there is no need to switch. But if you worked on bigger projects and bigger components, this new API might working on those projects easier, because it's easier, as I showed, to organize data and logic next to each other and to share and reuse logic. Therefore, this new API is a great addition, but of course not a must-use thing if you prefer the old API, which will be fully supported in Vue 3. Nonetheless, I would recommend that you also dive into this new API, and I showed some of the most important building blocks here. Of course, there are some things to memorize. Reactive and ref for managing reactive data, that computed returns an object with a value property, things like this, but I showed them all in this video. And in addition, below the video, I mentioned before, I attached some links which you can dive into to have a look at the official documentation, so to say, for this new API, learn about the reasons the Vue team mentions there, and also see the full syntax and all the configuration options you have available. With that, I hope that this video was helpful and at least got you started with the new API and could show a bit why it might be interesting for some applications. The core takeaway, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning already, is that Vue 3 adds this new optional API, brings us better performance no matter which API we use, and in general will probably be a great new version of Vue, which doesn't force you to change anything if you don't want to, but which allows you to write your apps in this new, maybe for some apps more efficient mode.